This week, 2024 Campaign Trail takes you to New York, where former President Trump spoke to the press outside hearings for 2 of the court cases he's facing. And to North Carolina, where President Biden and Vice President Harris were on the road, touting their administration's support for the Affordable Care Act. We'll also look at the latest ads from the 2 presidential campaigns and preview the U.S. Senate race in Montana this year. But first, we're in Oakland, California. That's the hometown of Nicole Shanahan, the lawyer, tech executive, and philanthropist independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced as his vice presidential pick on Tuesday. Next, some of Mr. Kennedy's introduction of her and some of her first-ever political address.
The Democrats and Republicans are trying to divide America. They tell us to hate each other, to mistrust each other, to accuse each other of treason, to warn us against these, in apocalyptical terms, that democracy itself is doomed if the other side wins. They turn families against each other. They turn neighbors against each other and friends against each other. They're trying to divide America, but Nicole and I will unite it. And that's our path to victory. That's how we're going to win. That's how we're going to forge an unstoppable coalition of homeless Democrats and homeless Republicans who are ready to look at the universal values that unite us all, and that every conscientious American wants the same way Nicole wants it and I want it. All of those things that I described: our love, our children, good food, good soils, moral authority around the world, the end of the warfare state, an incorruptible government. All of those things we all want. If we can only persuade enough Americans to vote out of hope rather than of fear, we're going to be in the White House in November. Nicole and I are running to help heal the symptoms of an ailing America, to heal our divisions, to heal our economy, to heal our mental health and our spiritual and our physical health. But we can't do it alone. We need you. And now I have a governing partner who will fight for you and for your family until the last corporate kickback from our government, the last toxin, is cleared from our water and our soil. Until the last American child gets to live a healthy life and to pursue their own happiness in the land of the free, until the last censor is gone from our government. I'm confident that there is no American more qualified than Nicole Shanahan to play this role. So I'm proud to introduce to all of you the next Vice President of the United States of America, Nicole Shanahan. Thank you all very much.
Hi, everybody. And thank you so much for being here today. It is so good to be here in Oakland. This city will always have a special place in my heart. You know, I grew up just a few miles from this very spot. My mother, who's standing right there with her phone up, she immigrated here from Guangzhou, China. And my late father was an Irish and German American. So these are 2 of my political convictions I hold today: to serve peace and to help those in poverty. Yeah. So you can understand why I gravitated to the Democratic Party, because that was supposed to be the party of peace, the party of compassion. Many Democrats, we still believe in those ideals, but unfortunately, as an institution, it has lost its way. I am so hopeful for this. I hope you all understand now what has brought me into politics. And when, in this moment, I am leaving the Democratic Party. And I want to say two things about that. First, even though I am leaving the party, I believe I am taking the best ideals and impulses with me. The Democratic Party is supposed to be the party of compassion. It is supposed to be the party of diplomacy and science. It is supposed to be the party of civil liberties and free speech, and most importantly, the party of the middle class and the American dream. While I know many Democrats still abide by those values, I want to point out, and I've been in touch with many people in the Democratic Party, I do believe they've lost their way in their leadership. I worry for the party's overwhelming interest in elitism, celebrity, and winning at all costs. And I worry that they do it even if that means turning a blind eye on the issues that they all know to be true. I know this because I've been in those circles for the last 8 years, and I have grown increasingly tired of it. It wasn't until I met Bobby and the people supporting him that I felt any hope in the outcome of this election. As I've re-examined my Democratic Party assumptions, I have seen conservative voters with new eyes too. I have met farmers, I have met hunters who are some of the most staunch conservationists I have ever met, who understand ecosystems better than most. I have met mothers protecting their children who are searching every possible avenue for their health. And yet the Republican Party, like the Democratic, is letting them down because the actions of the party are diverting from the values that actually support individual freedom. In fact, the very failure of both parties to do their job to protect their founding values has contributed to the decline of this country in my lifetime. Maybe that's why I see so many Republicans disillusioned with their party as I become disillusioned with mine. If you are one of those disillusioned Republicans, I welcome you to join me, a disillusioned Democrat, in this movement to unify and heal America.
President Biden and Vice President Harris took their campaign to Raleigh, North Carolina this past week, where they talked extensively about their administration's support for the Affordable Care Act. An Associated Press poll in February showed American voters trusted Democrats more than Republicans to address health care affordability concerns, something the Biden-Harris campaign is hoping to capitalize on. Next, some of the president and vice president's joint appearance in the Tar Heel state.
But while President Biden and I are fighting to expand access to affordable health care, there are extremists in our country trying to take away health care coverage or make it more expensive. Extremists who want to take away coverage from our seniors by trying to cut Social Security and Medicare. They want to take away coverage for working families by trying to gut Medicaid. And they want to take away coverage from people with pre-existing conditions by continuously trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And across our nation, extremists attack a woman's access to health care and reproductive health care. They have proposed and passed laws that criminalize doctors and punish women, laws that threaten doctors and nurses with prison time, even for life, simply for providing reproductive care. Laws that even make no exception for rape or incest. The result is a health care crisis with real harm.
The Affordable Care Act is the most consequential health care since Medicare and Medicaid, and that's a fact. It was always about millions of Americans lying in bed, staring at the ceiling at night, wondering what will happen if I lose my insurance. I'll never forget my dad came home one day. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 4 kids and a grandpa living with us. And my bedroom wall backed up to where they were. And I could hear my dad was restless as hell. I couldn't understand why. And the next morning, I was 14 years old. I asked my mom, what's the matter? She said, well, he just lost his health insurance. The company he worked for no longer is paying for health insurance. You know, there's a lot of people lying in bed at night staring at the ceiling, literally wondering what will happen if my spouse gets cancer or my child gets seriously ill. But Donald Trump and his MAGA friends are, if nothing but persistent. They've tried to repeal it 50 times, not a joke, 50 times they've tried to repeal it. But we stop them every time. And now they just released the budget again. 120 or 160, I'm not sure how many of the House members put out their budget for next year. They want to get rid of the Affordable Health Care Act again. But I got news for them. We're going to stop them again. Look, Kamala and I have come back to North Carolina to celebrate the ACA and to remind all of us we can't take anything for granted. Through laws I wrote and signed, the American Rescue Plan, the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which not a single solitary Republican in the Congress voted for. I enacted tax credits to save an average of $800 per person per year, reducing health care premiums for millions of working families under the Affordable Care Act. Those tax credits expire next year. I'm calling on Congress to make that $800 expanded affordable health care tax credit permanent. Otherwise, millions of Americans with that coverage could lose their coverage. Folks, it's because we're making the ACA stronger, more affordable. ACA enrollment is breaking records. Today, everyone can get affordable coverage through the ACA. And 80% of the folks on the ACA plan can get a plan for $10 a month. $10 a month. 21 million people covered under ACA, a 75% increase just since Kamala and I came to office. And that includes over 1 million folks right here in North Carolina. Folks, here's the deal. My predecessor and MAGA Republicans in Congress have a different plan. Let's remember, 4 years ago this month, we saw how my predecessor didn't care much about science and reason. During the pandemic, that went on to claim 1 million American lives. And for every life claimed, it's estimated there's between 8 and 10 people left behind. Trump didn't level with the American people. He told Americans all they had to do was inject bleach in themselves. Remember that? Not a joke. You'd think I'm making this up if you just take a real shot of UV light. Even before the pandemic, my Republicans in Congress were hell-bent on getting rid of the ACA. They came within one vote. But a close friend of mine, we used to argue like hell, but we spent a lot of time together over the years. But it failed because of my deceased friend John McCain going like this. But even during the deadly pandemic, Trump and his MAGA friends in Congress wanted to get rid of the ACA, kick millions of Americans off their health insurance. It's sick. Now they want to, quote his word, terminate the ACA, as my predecessor says. If that ever happened, we'd also terminate a lot of lives as well. But we're not going to let that happen, are we? We're not going to let that happen.
Sticking on the theme of healthcare, the Biden-Harris campaign also released the following ad, highlighting former President Trump's opposition to the Affordable Care Act.
Obamacare is a disaster.
What we'd like to do is totally kill it.
I hope that they end it.
Obamacare is a catastrophe.
It'll be so good if they end it.
The Trump campaign, meanwhile, kept its message in its latest ad, focused squarely on border security.
From all over the world they came.
Angola.
Millions of illegal border crossers have entered the country unlawfully.
Egypt. Cameroon.
They're coming by the thousands. Nobody could afford this, and even morally, it's so wrong.
Venezuela!
You're not smart enough to know who I am, but soon you're gonna know who I am.
We will secure our borders and we will restore our sovereignty.
They recognize the fact that Joe Biden is more favorable president for immigrants. Trump or Biden?
Biden, of course.
Former President Trump, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, didn't hold any campaign events over the past week. But he did appear twice this past Monday in New York City as he attended 2 court hearings, one civil and one criminal. Next, his reaction to some of the day's proceedings in Manhattan.
This is a case that could have been brought 3.5 years ago. And now they're fighting over days because they want to try and do it during the election. This is election interference. That's all it is. Election interference. And it's a disgrace. We'll obviously be appealing. But this is a pure case of voter intimidation and election interference. And it shouldn't be allowed to happen. This case could have been brought by the DA, but they didn't want to bring it because they said they have no case. And then they bring it anyway. As you know, DA Bragg did not want to bring this case. He was forced into it for outside reasons, and it's a disgrace that it can happen. But this was a case that could have been brought 3.5 years ago, and they decide to wait now, just during the election, so that I won't be able to campaign. We'll be appealing this. On the other decision, it will be my honor to post, and we'll post whatever is necessary, whether it be cash or securities or bonds. It was a decision we appreciate and respect the appellate division very much. And we will, I think, do very well in that whole thing. We have a judge who I believe is a crooked judge and a crooked attorney general, absolutely crooked. We did nothing wrong at all, 100%. And that was proven, and everybody there said it was proven. All you have to do is read the legal scholars, and you see that it was proven. But we will continue with that, but we appreciate very much the decision of the appellate division. Thank you very much.
What's your collateral for the bond?
Cash.
If you're elected, will you pardon yourself?
Next, a look at some of our conversation with Pete Maysmith of the League of Conservation Voters on our Morning Washington Journal program. He talked about the group's high marks for President Biden's environmental policies.
What grade would you give President Biden on his climate change agenda?
We'd give President Biden an A on his climate change agenda. He has done more to tackle the climate crisis than any president in the history of this country. It's exactly what the moment calls for. If you look at legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, it's the largest, most significant piece of legislation ever passed in the United States, or actually anywhere in the world, to tackle climate change. It'll jumpstart and move us forward on the clean energy revolution, get us off of fossil fuels. It'll make our communities healthier and safer, and it's exactly what we need. There's other pieces of legislation, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill that addresses lead in water, puts a huge boost for electric vehicle charging stations. And then if you look at executive action, just last week, clean car standards, which will give Americans all around the country more choices for cleaner cars, save cost, and things like putting a pause on the export terminals of liquefied natural gas. All of these are important actions that this president has taken, and that's why he gets such a high grade on tackling climate change and just being a pro-environment president across the board.
Young voters that care about the climate are not as enthused with President Biden's record. Here is A New York Times headline, many young voters bitter over Biden's support of the Willow oil drilling. Reminder viewers of the Willow oil drilling debate. And is there a concern on your part that young voters who care about this issue won't be voting for President Biden?
Well, I think there's a concern that we need to engage young voters on this issue. That is undoubtedly true. And to be clear, we don't agree with this administration on everything that they did. We disagreed on the decision on that Willow project, which is in Alaska, and allowed for more oil and gas drilling. We don't think that was the right thing to do. But if you look at, say, protecting Bristol Bay in Alaska from drilling, that's an important step forward. If you look at this most recent action a couple of months ago to pause the permitting of liquefied natural gas export terminals, might sound kind of technical and wonky, but that's standing up to big oil. That's telling big oil, no, you can't get what you want. They're not used to hearing that. Communicating that type of action with young voters in particular is hugely important. That's something that we're doing. We're going to continue to do over the course of the next 225 days up until the election.
Pete Maysmith, how much does the League of Conservation Voters plan to spend in this election cycle to get President Biden reelected?
Well, for President Biden and pro-environment champs up and down the ballot, $120 million. That's more than we've ever done. If you look back to 2016, it was only $45 million. I think that increase in numbers speaks to a couple of things. One, the urgency of the climate crisis, the fact that we just have to tackle it. Two, that climate change has become more enmeshed in our politics in a deeper way. It's more important for many, many voters, including young voters, but not limited to young voters. And also because of the results that we've seen with this administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, putting us back in the Paris climate accords, pausing the LNG export terminals, the clean car standards, et cetera. Much, much more than just that. So what that says is people know that this pro-environment, pro-climate administration, there's so much more that they want to do, they need to do in a second term. And of course, we have to work to make sure that's the case, and that there's pro-climate majorities in the U.S. Senate. There currently is. Keep that in place. But then, of course, change the leadership in the United States House is vital as well.
Where does climate rank for voters' top issue in 2024? And has that ranking helped you in raising more funding that you can then turn around and spend on re-electing or getting pro-climate candidates elected?
Well, for a number of voters, it ranks very high. Again, in particular, young voters, but not just young voters. Voters of color, in many instances, rank climate change, not necessarily at the top, but up on their list. And again, if you look back to where we were 10, certainly 20 years ago, but really even 10 years ago, the issue of climate change has become more and more important as how voters think about making their choices. If you look back to the 2020 Democratic primary, Joe Biden, along with all the other candidates, put out aggressive climate change platforms because they knew it was a vote getter in the primary, and then brought that message forward into the general election against a climate change denier. Donald Trump has called climate change a hoax. So it was part of the debate in 2020, and that's because climate change matters increasingly to voters.
Arn Kimball-Sannett is a reporter with the Montana Free Press. A lot of eyes on Montana's Senate race this year. John Tester, the Democrat there, considered one of the most endangered incumbents. Who is on the GOP side lining up to run against him?
So the most prominent candidate that we have lining up to challenge Tester is a man named Tim Sheehy. He's a Republican, a businessman. He owns a aerial firefighting company in Belgrade, which is a suburb of Bozeman here in Montana. He hasn't been in the state very long, a little over a decade, which can sometimes be a live political issue in a state that really values multi-generational roots. But he is, as with many of the candidates recruited by the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which is chaired by Montana's other U.S. Senator, Steve Daines, he is independently wealthy. He's able to self-fundraise, and he is somebody onto whom voters can project their aspirations effectively. He has no voting record. He's never held elected office. He's never even run for office before. He's been in the GOP donor class for a few years. But this is his first foray into the limelight. Farther down the ballot, Brad Johnson, who's a former Montana Secretary of State and Public Service Commissioner, He's also running in the Republican primary, but I think most of the sort of institutional money and support and most people's expectations are pointing towards Tim Sheehy.
Now, of Tim Sheehy and Brad Johnson, who's winning the endorsement game right now?
Well, it's Tim Sheehy. I mean, Tim Sheehy has Trump's endorsement. I mean, I think that is probably the most important endorsement you could have in a Republican primary. He also has the endorsements of basically every other prominent statewide Republican in the state, such as Governor Greg Gianforte, Congressman Ryan Zinke, who, like Tim Sheehy, is a former Navy SEAL and has actually awarded Tim Sheehy a medal in the past. He has all of those folks lined up behind him, as well as I said, the national Republican sort of infrastructure. No diss to Brad Johnson. I think he's kind of a long shot candidate in this race, but he does have an interesting perspective. For those who were observing, part of the drama around Tim Sheehy's nomination was whether he would face a primary challenge from Matt Rosendale, who's a Republican hardline congressman from Montana, who had all but pledged to run for Senate and then ran for Senate for 6 days. And then when it became clear, basically, that the National Party and Donald Trump would do anything they could to stop him, he dropped out of that race. So I think that was the real kind of primary drama. Without Rosendale in the race, Johnson is there to try to provide voters a choice, someone who isn't, as he says, handpicked by the DC establishment. But I'm not sure how much that argument will really resonate with voters. Tim Sheehy certainly leads in fundraising and endorsements.
And what are the issues that are really motivating Montanans this year?
Well, this is 2024, so all politics are national. It's basically these same things. We have candidates who live thousands of miles away from the southern border who have already made their kind of, required Republican pilgrimages to Eagle Pass and whatnot. So people are worried, or at least I should say candidates are telling us that people are worried about border security, about fentanyl. Montana has long had a big issue with drug use. Fentanyl is kind of, I think, the drug du jour in terms of the popular discourse. And there's, of course, legitimate concerns there. People are talking a lot about that. Property taxes is probably one of the big local issues. This is something that realistically gets dealt with at the state legislative level, but it has really risen to the top as Montana wrestles with a pretty dramatic cost of living crisis in a state that has otherwise been not that desirable for people to move to until pretty recently. So I think you'll hear a lot about affordability and, the Montana way of life, Montana values, always gets trotted out. What that means varies from person to person, of course, but, that's something that candidates want to run on preserving. They want to run on, is looking at people like John Tester. They want to run away from Joe Biden. I think one of our Democratic gubernatorial candidates, Ryan Bussey, is taking a similar tack. They understand that Biden is unpopular, that he loses Montana, but that Democrats can still win in the state if they establish themselves basically as people who you would typecast as conservatives, except they'll vote with Democrats. That's really the play for Democrats here. But also, I think that, and whether this works is hard for me to say, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of candidates make a big deal about how long they've been in Montana, how not long their opponent has been in Montana. John Tester, as he would be the first to tell you, has multi-generational roots in Montana, has farmed the same plot of dirt in Montana for a long time. Tim Sheehy is like a rich tech guy who moved here not that long ago. And for some slice of the electorate who's really attached to that traditional image of Montana, that could be a compelling argument. But I think basically, especially for the Senate race, which is so national in its context because of the margin in the U.S. Senate, it's safe to say that most of the issues you hear on the campaign trail, at least from the candidates, are pretty similar to the issues you would hear from candidates in other tight races across the country.
Oren Kimball-Stannett, reporter with the Montana Free Press. Thanks so much for your time and expertise.
Thank you.
A reminder, this program and all of C-SPAN's campaign 2024 coverage can be found online at cspan.org/campaign.